So these are the focus areas for new investments in the Sahel. Next slide. I'm not going to go fully through this, and we will provide this slide deck to you guys, but this is just an example of the type of joint analysis that came out of these planning cells, looking at the dynamics and drivers of change in the Sahel. And if you look at the bottom, we really have tried to look at sort of core drivers: poverty, marginalization, water scarcity, and weak governance as a backdrop against which these drivers were occurring. The underlying causes: population pressure. Niger has the highest population growth rate in the world. Climate change and variability, and a shift to a cash-based economy. Now that's not necessarily a negative thing, but with the variability of food prices and then the sort of tectonic shift in 2008, it's never actually returned, of food prices rising, it was a source of vulnerability. So these shouldn't be viewed as sort of negative things, they're actually just sources of vulnerability. They operate through a number of proximate causes: indebtedness, declining land holdings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to lead to an overall trend of a growing, what we were calling a growing resilience deficit, both in breadth, meaning the number of people, but also in depth. And then we also looked at what are the innovations and adaptations already underway. That is, that Sahelians are already engaged in and are making themselves more resilient. And there were examples, a key one being something called farmer-managed natural regeneration and water harvesting. It's led to the regreening of 5 million hectares in Niger over the last 30 years. And it's a very interesting case of an initial idea being planted with outside assistance through NGO programs, those programs going away, and then this thing spreading organically, facilitated by NGOs in some places, but mainly organically. So really, truly being an organic adaptation to this vulnerability already underway. And so that was sort of our analysis and our end goal. If you look at the graph, this is the actual distribution of houses using a household economy analysis in agropastoralist populations in Niger. Is the blue bar where they sit in these groups, and we're trying to shift the entire distribution of these communities rightward, recognizing that the prospects of the vulnerable and assistance dependent are intimately tied to those who are entrepreneurial and thriving and those who are already adapting and resilient. When we think about that group on the far left, those are people without access to land or very limited access to land, who rely primarily on employment. Who are the people employing them? The people on the right. So just a recognition of the need to work with whole communities. Go ahead. We also went through a joint planning process, and again, this predates, somewhat informs the framework in the policy, although this is a program results framework, so not a conceptual framework for the policy. But this gives you some sense of the nature of the new investments in the Sahel, which, to be frank, are not wholly different from the ones in the Horn. There is a lot of contextual differences between the Horn and Sahel, but some of the core problems are very similar. You see we've organized the new investments, and this is actually new investments layered on top of existing investments into sort of 3 categories: increased and sustainable economic well-being, strengthened institutions and governance, sort of broadly conceived, and improved health and nutritional status. And I'm glad to hear that governance has come up as such an important issue, and to be frank, we had the same struggle. Is it an objective? Is it an approach to achieving other objectives? And I think the answer we finally came to is it's actually all of that. And then so we were thinking of governance very broadly in terms of strengthening natural resource management, disaster risk management, so things like safety nets would be under that, and conflict management. And then a very key one for us was the relationship between formal institutions of the state and informal institutions. In a lot of these areas, the state institutions are not well established. They're sort of hinterland areas. The traditional institutions used to be responsible for some of these things like natural resource management have been eroded. Now there's a need to strategically have them work together to provide governments, fill this governance vacuum. And then you see along the bottom, innovation, knowledge management, and some other cross-cutting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a learning agenda, which is, I think, a great opportunity to link what you guys are doing to these new investments. Okay, next slide.